So, good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor and a privilege to be invited here again today. I've not been in Oman for 8 years or so. I was involved in the design of the spot market here, and it's quite a privilege to come back and at least learn some of the stories about the successes and the not yet successes that we see with the market. I'm going to start by abusing my speaker's privilege by answering a question from the previous panel. If you want to get interconnection functioning properly, do you start with the infrastructure or the regulation? Power is the most volatile commodity on the planet. So I would say the other thing you need is having some indicator of the value of electricity in real time at the time when you're deciding how to use the interconnector. So you need to have spot markets, which helps you have efficient dispatch and effective use of that interconnection capacity. So let me move on to the material I'm presenting. I've worked on market design for nearly 30 years, all of my career in energy as an economist. We're a part of a big Swedish engineering company, but I'm part of the economic consulting part of that. And we've teams globally, headquartered in Europe, but a presence here in the Middle East as well. So you'll be familiar with this starting point. I'm going to go easy on you to begin with. There are three mega trends. You will have seen this a lot of times. There's the decarbonization story, which doesn't just mean replacing thermal and fossil generation with renewables. It also means electrifying types of industry that weren't previously electric, so heat, transport, and heavy industry. So there's the decarbonization story. To go with that, there is the decentralization story. Now, that's not just that we are installing decentralized generation technologies. Increasingly, the flexibility and stability technologies will be decentralized. So we're decentralizing the points that help us keep the grid stable. And we're also digitalizing to enable that transition. So we're, in Britain, we have a plan to decarbonize our power system completely by 2030. It's a 50 gigawatt system. Within that, the grid operator's done a scenario that says we need a gigawatt of vehicle to grid by 2030, 28 gigawatts of vehicle to grid capacity by 2040. And that's in what's currently a 50 gigawatt system. So the types of control that we need in future are going to be very different to the kind of centralized tools that we have today. So the storyline today is about this balance between centralized direction and control and using markets. And I think that balance has changed a lot in the time that I've been in the industry. I came into the industry in Britain at the time when we were abolishing our central dispatch market, abolishing our capacity mechanism, and moving to a real-time market with volatile prices. And the intention was that that would drive investment as well. And every market kind of said the same thing. We need more liberalization, although maybe not yet and maybe not very quickly, but we agree that's the direction of travel. And if you listen to nothing else of my slides, that's not the universal North Star anymore. Many of the markets that liberalized first are kind of reverting to some form of centralized control, at least for the investment and the choice of investment and the choice of technology. But we do need to double down on the spot markets and their effectiveness. So as you decarbonize a system, you bring three technical challenges. There's a locational challenge about where things connect, and we heard earlier about the connection queues, but also about the grid congestion, the need to build new infrastructure, but the need for new tools for congestion management within the infrastructure that we have. There's a second dimension, not the spatial dimension, but the temporal dimension, different challenges of flexibility and stability, and we don't often talk about stability in a grid, but I think we'll talk about it a little bit more after the incidents in Spain recently. So there's a locational problem, there's a flexibility and stability problem, and that's over a range of time frames. But there is also a risk and volatility problem. And the scale of risk in the power sector has gone up and up to a stage where we're actually starting to need to centrally support even conventional investment decisions in a way that markets in the liberalized countries weren't doing 10 years ago. So this is just a couple of examples of how this temporal dimension is changing. So in the old days, you solved your stability problem and your peak demand problem and your seasonal balance problem, as well as all of your within-day ramping problem, all with gas plants with a pipe, or a coal plant with a coal pile. As we replace those plants from the system and from the operation, we're replacing them with things that have completely different characteristics. So on the one hand, when we dimension our system capacity needs, our adequacy needs, we look at the peak demand. The chart on the left shows how that changes. We've done some studies which show that today a peak demand event lasts for 4 hours. So you think, well, a 2-hour battery can contribute 50% to that. By 2040 in Britain, the average duration of a scarcity event is not 4 hours, but 40 hours. So if you think batteries are the solution to intermittency, that view gets challenged pretty quickly. If you look on the right-hand side, though, we start to see a need for instantaneous stability, longer duration storage. If you sell ancillary services and frequency response as a byproduct for energy, having a marketplace for ancillary services isn't very important. But if you expect people to build dedicated technologies, or even to be primarily providing reactive power and ancillary services instead of energy, it's not important just to have a spot market for energy. You need to start having spot markets for those other services as well. And to complement the spot markets, you may need some longer-term investment support mechanisms for people to build synchronous condensers and grid-forming converters to stabilize the system when we have a high level of solar non-synchronous generation connected. This is just some examples of the way that different types of technology, the example is from Britain, but it doesn't matter, how they make their money and looking at the different revenue streams. And I've got another slide that shows that, just recent history. In 2015, 94% of the wholesale revenue was energy in Britain, and 6% was ancillary services. So 94 and 6% in 2015. By 2020, the energy share in Britain had dropped from 94 to 80%. The ancillary services had nearly doubled, and we'd created a capacity market as well. So that was just in 5 years. And the expectation is that energy becomes less and less important, and ancillary services become more and more important, whether or not you have separate capacity support mechanisms. Britain liberalized first in Europe. We created our first spot market and a stock-listed transmission system operator in 1990. We liberalized the market completely. I came in to work for the regulator when we did the second liberalization, which came in 2001, where we decentralized further. We moved away from this engineering-led central dispatch mandatory spot market. They still have that in the US markets, by the way. They still think central dispatch is a good idea. I don't see how you can centrally dispatch 10 million cars. So for me, that's definitely the past, not the future. But that's a separate conversation. But in Britain, although we're doubling down on the spot markets, we've actually renationalized our national electricity system operator. So furthermore, we haven't just nationalized the system operator. The transmission ownership remains separate in private hands. But we've also given them planning responsibility for power, gas, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage networks. And they're not just planning at the transmission level, they're responsible for coordinating the planning right down to the regional distribution levels for power and gas. So we're centralizing some of the planning regime. And by the way, just about everything that will get built in Britain in the next 10 years will have some kind of dedicated support mechanism. We have capacity mechanisms which are supposed to be technology neutral. but they're not, because we have to calculate the contribution of a 1 and a 2-hour battery to the system need. So there's lots of system operator calculations go into those derating factors. We have a separate mechanism, a cap and floor regime for interconnection. We're just developing a new support mechanism for nuclear to replace the one that was for the last nuclear plant. And we're now developing another support mechanism for long-duration energy storage. We're doing connection reform. So essentially in Britain, we are going through the process of kind of re-centralizing the types of investment that get made in which technology and in which location. Britain is doing its own review of market arrangements, and I'll not go into the detail here, but we are basically considering absolutely everything. Some things have been ruled out, but for a while, the system operator wanted nodal pricing and central planning, and thankfully we're not going backwards in time, so we're not doing that. We will probably have zonal pricing, but we will keep the decentralized market. And there was even a consideration of abandoning the concept of marginal pricing and having separate prices for renewables than from conventional generation, because there's some political pressure that as we squeeze gas out of the system, it still sets prices most of the time. So there are some political issues around the concepts of marginal cost pricing. So we are revising or reviewing just about everything. And one of the big undecided things is whether or not we will move to zonal pricing. Another big undecided thing is how we reward different types of flexibility and what new system services we create for the future. So the story is that market design is a series of compromises and trade-offs, and there is no right answer. The things that worked 10 years ago for the circumstances and the level of risk and volatility that we had 10 years ago don't necessarily work for today's market. We see new system needs developing, particularly for short-term fast response and inertia, and that will happen here too. If we see 30% renewables by 2030 here in Oman, that will start to become an issue, and I'm sure it's part of the problem in Spain in the last few days that they haven't taken that into consideration. So we need the development of new system services, but we do need efficient wholesale market dispatch, market coupling with interconnection. There's a lot of uncertainty about how we should be getting the right investment patterns for the future. And if you put too much risk on the investors, that has to be paid for by the market. So governments, certainly in the liberalized markets in Europe, are finding ways of supporting lots of different technologies, and we're moving away from the philosophy that the market chooses the technology. The other big unanswered question in this region is how quickly we should press ahead with retail competition. And again, 20 years ago, I would have said that's the last thing you do. But now I think it's essential. Most of our flexibility could come from, as I say, heat pumps and electric cars. I've got an electric car. I need 10 hours of electricity any time in a week. I'm part of the long-duration storage solution. But if you don't embrace those technologies, we'll end up spending billions on batteries that you didn't actually need. So for me, getting the demand side working is actually a critical part of this new world. So my takeaways: the decarbonization of our systems is happening everywhere, and it's creating parallel challenges that we can all learn from each other on. The scale of the challenge and the speed of the transition is forcing us to centralize, in particular, the coordination of the different technology choices. If we didn't do that, it simply wouldn't happen at the pace the governments want. But while we're doing that, the broader market is getting increasingly decentralized. And governments are trying to take control of the decisions driving the technology mix. And that's a slippery slope, because when you start intervening and offering subsidies for things, it's very difficult to persuade investors that the next round of investors is going to be more market-based. So markets still have a very important part to play. And I would say there are two things that nearly every market could do with more of. More interconnection, and that includes better use of the interconnection with spot prices, and more demand-side response. And what makes those two magic ingredients work is the volatility of the prices. So that is also an essential ingredient. So at that point, I'll stop and take my seat. Thank you very much.